So welcome back, everyone. We will start this last session of the day, which is going to be on paleontology again. And the first talk will be presented by Sophie Sanchez from Uppsala.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. I'm going to speak. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to speak about the three-dimensional virtual bone histology of stem tetrapod revealed by synchrotron light. First of all, this is a talk where you can see only my name, but I want to specify that this is a work in collaboration with all these co-authors. So this is a combination of paleontologists and physicists, and they are all from engineers, professors, students, and postdocs. And they all come from different parts of the world, so essentially in Europe, Norway, Sweden, England, France, and Germany. And we have two colleagues coming from the US. I will speak today about the fin-to-limb transition. And so why is it an important evolutionary event? Because this is the origin of the limb. So when I speak of our limbs, I speak of our arm, for example, or our leg. And so understanding this event is a really, really key and crucial event in the evolutionary history of vertebrates. And it's important to investigate it because we usually investigate the development of the limb for understanding the diversity of this limb, the adaptation of tetrapods, and as well the pathology. But the most complicated thing is that you have an element here, which is the upper arm bone, so the humerus. And the idea is to find an homologous element in the ray fin fish, like the zebrafish, for example. And that's a very challenging and tricky problem. So a lot of researchers investigate the development and the gene regulation within a model like zebrafish. But for us, as paleontologists, it's really, really derived to consider that. And so it's important to consider lobefin fish, intermediate form which have lobefin fins with homologous elements. So the main problem is investigating the homologies. So when I speak of a limb, I speak of an appendage with digits. And this is what you have in all tetrapods, embracing the frogs, for example, mammals, crocodiles, birds, etc. And so if we consider the fin-to-limb transition, we will consider and we will focus today on this part of the evolutionary tree, which is within the lobefin fish, and we will really focus on this element. So as I told you, why is it that important to investigate the limb skeleton? It's really important because you have such an adaptation of all the ecosystem, all the environments. If you check, for example, the jumping limb of the frogs, or the modification of the upper limb into a wing in the birds, or into a paddle in the marine mammals, for example, the whales. And it can have as well a strong musculature, for example, in the lion or in like running mammals. Or it can have a very strong skeleton that could support a 300 kilogram shell, for example, in tortoises. So all this limb diversity, this large diversity of morphologies, was a key point for full radiation of tetrapods on Earth. So that's a key element for us as paleontologists and evolutionary biologists. But for the doctors, it's really important to understand also the development of the limb so that they can investigate all the pathologies. So usually they investigate gene regulation and development in models like the mouse, for example, and then they try to understand all the pathologies that they would see in humans to investigate and to try to resolve the problem of development. And as I told you, usually the researcher, they take as a model the mouse within the mammals or the zebrafish. So why do they take this type of research model? It's really easy to breed them in the lab, to reproduce them. So they can be kept in lab. They can also be, they can reproduce quite often. So they have a lot of babies that they can investigate, so they can have a big number of animals to test. And as well, they have quite a fast development, especially for the zebrafish, and they can really study all the development as fast as possible. The problem, as I told you, is that they are pretty derived from an evolutionary point of view, which means that they have evolved quite a lot. And they show a pattern, well, they show genes, a gene pattern, which is quite derived compared to the early vertebrate pattern that we would have at the origin. So the idea would be to investigate what's happening first within the lobefin fish to really understand the homologies and the development between the humerus, for example, of a tetrapod and the humerus of a lobefin fish. So you could say, let's take an extant animal like the coelacanth or like a lungfish, a dipnoid. That would be a good choice, probably, because they are lobefin fish. But first, if you would check their appendage skeleton, they would have a cartilaginous skeleton. So that means they do not mineralize at all. So they are not good model for that reasons. In addition, it's really and pretty difficult to breed a coelacanth or to breed a lungfish, and their development is really, really slow. You would have to wait 10 years before you get a baby. So your research may be a bit tricky. So there are not good models for studying the fin-to-limb transition in that respect. So the idea, as a paleontologist, we had the idea to look at fossils like this Eusthenopteron. This is a lobefin fish, which was living during the Devonian, so 360 million years ago, and which has an ossified fin like that. So first, it has an ossified mineralized fin, and in addition, we can have several, like a growth series, so we can study as well the development of these animals. So how does a limb bone grow? So it all starts, whatever the group, ray finfish or tetrapod, it all starts with a cartilaginous rod. That means a ball of cartilage in the development. These cartilaginous cells in the middle, they will become bigger, and at the same time, you will get the invasion of the blood vessels, the vascularization. The blood vessels, they will bring all the nutrients and they will bring all the bone cells to form this cylindrical bone that you have around the cartilage. So the bone will be deposited around the cartilaginous rod. And then progressively, the blood vessels will invade the space of the cartilage, and you will have an erosion of the cartilage. So this is all the fundamental and the basic development that you will see in a ray finfish and in a tetrapod. But then afterwards in the development, you have the ossification inside through a very specific process of the bone in the bone of the tetrapod, like humans, which is not as complex and as developed in the ray finfish. So already, if you look at a limb bone, a long bone in a ray finfish and in a tetrapod, you will see some differences. The thing is that we don't know how this evolved. Does it evolve here or here? This is what we will try to investigate together today. So when did the first limb bone appear? So we know from 395 million years old that we have some traces of trackways. So you have some prints of limb with digits in this locality from Poland. But we don't have any bone associated with this locality. So the earliest limb bone that we could get was dated from 360 million years old, and this is from this group of Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. So if we put all these skeletal discoveries into the context, evolutionary context, you see that here, this is the first time in the evolution of the vertebrates that you get the digits. And so we will focus on this species, which is Acanthostega. So you have here the fossil on the plate. So you have the skull, the snout, the place where you have the eyes, the back of the skull, all the vertebral column, and the limbs. And this is a reconstruction of Acanthostega, the drawing. And for comparison, as I told you, we will take a lobefin fish, Lacus tenopteron, which is here, and this is the fin of this lobefin fish. You have the fossil here with the head, the jaw and the snout, and you have all the body with all the scales and the fins up to the caudal fin. And here, this is a drawing of the animal. So I would like to answer 3 questions with you today. So the first one is, what does an early tetrapod limb bone look like? So in other words, what is the bone microstructures of the earliest limb bone? The second question is, how different is that from the fin bone of a lobefin fish? And then the last one is, can we reconstruct the flesh of these early appendages? For answering these questions, we will need to use the synchrotron, and especially the synchrotron of DSRF. So first of all, the fossils, and some of the fossils, not all of them, but some of the fossils we are investigating for understanding this topic are coming from very, very remote locality. And so Acanthostega, the earliest limb that we have been investigating, come from Greenland. So it's a pretty remote place, and you had some Swedish and Danish expedition in the 30s and 70s, in the 50s, sorry. And so it's pretty expensive. It asks for a lot of organization. Once you're there, it's pretty remote. You can have a snowstorm. You have polar bear to handle, so you have to know how to shoot, to learn all these things. So it's a lot of organization, a lot of money, and if you have any problem, it's not even sure that the helicopter will be able to come if there is like bad weather condition, or if you're too remote in the mountain. So for all these reasons, no curator would be able to give you any of these samples for sectioning. So for that reason, we actually need a non-destructive method. In addition, these samples are very, very dense, and they are infilled with metallic oxide, like Vincent had yesterday. So for them, we had to go to the energy up to 123 kV, so very, very high. We also need to apply a multi-scale approach. That means that you need to scan the entire bone at about 20 micron here, and then to do a spot at high resolution with a sub-micron voxel size to investigate, for example, the texture of the trabeculae, their orientation, their size, and as well, if you go now into this cylindrical bone that you had seen before, you can see here in purple the blood vessels where you have the canals, and this all gives you some information about the development and the biology of the animal. So this is crucial to get this information at different scales. And because your structures are very subtle, you have to use propagation phase contrast. And so for all the reasons that Paul and Vincent gave yesterday, we need the synchrotron beam properties as well as a big distance. So we were using 1 meter of propagation for low resolution and 150 millimeter for high resolution. As well, if we really want to understand what's happening in this transition, we need to use 3D virtual bone histology. And for that reason, we actually need a method that will provide the structure in 3D. And so if you combine all these features, all these properties, we actually needed to use propagation phase contrast synchrotron microtomography at the beamline ID19 and BM5. And we use as well X-ray diffraction CT at the beamline ID15, as well as transmission raster scanning XRD at ID27. And DSRF was the only synchrotron in the world that was able to provide such an efficient and sufficient powerful beam to investigate the sample we had. So let's answer the first question. So what does an early tetrapod limb bone look like? So as I told you, we will focus on one of these earliest limb bone that we have, Acanthostega. It's coming from Greenland, as I told you, from this locality. And at that time, it was not at all a snowy region, but it was more a tropical latitude region where you had a mass death locality. So we had like several individuals dying at the same time. And just to give you an idea of the environment, that's the Okavango Delta in Botswana. And so this was about the landscape that you could see 360 million years ago in Greenland. So pretty different from what we have today. So you had a small freshwater stream within inland delta. We investigated the 4 humeri which are known in the world, which have been discovered so far in the world. So the humerus, once again, this is this upper arm limb, bone. So we have 4 of them. They have different sizes. You have the youngest one here, which is the least mineralized, and the most mineralized is that one. And so if you compare them, you have 2 different classes. You have small ones and big ones, which are different from their degree of ossification. So we identified sexual dimorphism in these groups. And they are all coming from the same locality. You have your humerus here, the youngest one, sorry, and that's the oldest one. So if you do a virtual thin section at midshaft here, this is the image that you would see. And now that you are experts in limb development, limb bone development, you can see that you have a cortical bone all around, which is really, really thin. And inside, all here, this is a very spongy bone. You have exactly the same configuration in the youngest individual as well as in the adult one, except that the cortical bone is only preserved in some places, here, here, or here. But apart from that, you have also a very extended spongy bone inside. This spongy bone is actually developed from the replacement of the cartilage into this spongy bone, which means that you have a big cartilage before you develop this spongy bone. And now if you look at this cortical bone, which is all around, so this is at high resolution, so 0.7 micron voxel size, you will see that you have rings here that you can count. So we found 6 rings, and they have exactly the same meaning as rings in trees. And for that reason, we were able to say that this animal had at least 6 years, but because we were able to see some remnants of the cartilage at the surface of the bone, we knew that before it was actually able to deposit the bone, it had to produce this very big cartilaginous root. So we suspect probably more a 10-year-old animal. But so if I sum up for this Acanthostega, apart from the fact that we had a big cartilaginous root before, so slightly delayed development, we actually have the same developmental mechanism as in extant tetrapods. So already 360 million years ago, we had exactly the same development of the limb bones. And how different is that from the fin bone of a lobefin fish? Here you have 2 different lobefin fish. One, Eusthenopteran, which is coming from Canada, from Miguasha. So as well, that was an equatorial climate with a brackish estuarine environment, and it was living among about 20 species of fish. And you have here Hyneria, coming from the northern part of the US, Catskill Formation, freshwater stream, and alluvial plain. And it was as well working within a diverse community of aquatic animals. So these are the 2 humeri of this lobefin fish. On the left, you have the humerus of Eusthenopteran, and here you have the humerus of Hyneria. If you cut virtually your bone, once again, what you will see is that you have around a very thin cortex, and inside a very spongy bone. Okay, so you remove so in purple you had all the sediment that has been removed, and you get the sediment back. And now if you investigate here the cortical bone, you will see that you have also some lines of rested growth, some ring like in Acanthostega and like in any of the tetrapods today. So the organization of the limb bones, fin bones, sorry, of the lobefin fish are exactly the same a thin cortex, and a spongy bone, so the same organization as in Acanthostega. If you investigate at high resolution the cortical bone, here, you see that you have some blood vessels, here in pink, as well as cell spaces. You can go up to the resolution of the cell spaces. And this is exactly what you would get, for example, if you would be looking at a human bone as well. We were able to investigate the spongy structure of inside the bone of the humerus of Eusthenoptera. And what we were able to identify was all these tubular processes which go longitudinally from the top of the bone, the proximal part, up to the distal part. And they are interconnected with each other. And they are very big, pretty limited. And for this reason, we could identify them as marrow processes, which means that inside you had marrow cells. Sorry. Okay. And the marrow cells, they play a major role for our body. So they have two big roles. They produce bone cells for the elongation of the bone. So if your bone grows and elongates, this is because bone cells are produced from the stem cells which are within the marrow, and they are also a major role in the hematopoiesis. The hematopoiesis, this is the production of blood cells, okay, all the blood cells you would see. And the human marrow produces approximately 500 billion blood cells per day, so it's quite a lot, and it's major. And we saw them, we have them in our bone marrow, and we saw these marrow processes in Eusthenoptera. And in 2008, Kapp et al. In Nature proposed a hypothesis. They investigated the marrow production, the blood cell production from the marrow in aquatic vertebrates, going from jawless vertebrates up to tetrapods. And they found out that the melanocytes, you know, there are these cells, dark cells, which protect the skin. They were forming a cover which was present on the top of the places where you had the production of blood cells, so the hematopoietic niches. And as far as they were looking at amphibious frogs, so these frogs which go from the water up to land, they were seeing a migration of these hematopoietic stem cells from the kidney and the liver, so where the melanocyte could protect them, into the bone marrow. So they suggested that this finding might indicate that the cortical bone around the bone marrow serves as a UV protection layer in lieu of melanocyte, which might explain why all terrestrial animals have their hematopoietic niche in the bone marrow. And they suggested that our Eusthenopteran probably had these marrow processes and was probably able to produce these bone cells within the bone and these blood cells, within the bone, just before the water-to-land transition. So today we are actually investigating that aspect within the fossils to see if that's relevant or not. But if I conclude on the development, although you have only digits within the earliest tetrapod, like like Acanthostega, you already have the long bone development present in the bone, like the humerus, of Eusthenopteran. So the idea is that the fin to limb transition, at least at the level of the skeleton in the tissue, may not be in that part of the tree, but probably should be shifted a bit earlier. And for that, we will need to investigate more fossils, probably dense fossils, which will need the improvement of DSRF. So now let's investigate the reconstruction of the flesh. So the flesh, they are the soft tissues on the top of the skeleton. Because it's important when you investigate the fin to limb transition to understand the development of the bone, but as well of the soft tissue, the muscles, for example. So is that possible to reconstruct the flesh in these animals? So we know that in a bone, you have the two parts. You have the organic element and the mineralized element. So the organic element is made of collagen molecules, which are all together within collagen fibrils, which form collagen fibers, and then after, these structures inside this part of the cortical bone. But during the development, this collagen molecule will be associated with apatite crystals. So that's the mineral part of the bone. And these apatite crystals, they align, so they are slightly elongated, and they align along the orientation of these collagen fibers. If you check here, for example, the arm of a frog, you will see that you have these collagen fibers all organized like that. And they are as well associated with muscle insertions. Here you have a muscle which has been cut, and here you have another muscle. And these muscles have fibers which are embedded into the bone. And they do mineralize the same way as the collagen fibers in the bone. So if you do a cross-section in the bone, so if you cut your humerus like that, what you will see here is that you have a muscle insertion. It's not really obvious with natural light. You see that you have a disturbance of the structures, but it's pretty obvious with polarized light. Here you see that you have a darker structure, which is different from the rest of the bone. With polarized light, you can actually have an information of the orientation of the apatite crystals. So all the apatite crystals which are in the bone, embedded in the bone, are actually oriented towards you. And those which are actually dark are parallel to the screen. And this is how we investigate the muscle insertions in the fossils. Here you have the bone of a fossil. This is a 300 million years old salamander. You have the fibers here which are of a different brightness from the rest of the bone. These are one muscle and another one muscle. If you look at normal light, you don't see it. And this is what you see when you do a radiography with synchrotron light. You actually cut your fiber spaces, so you will see small dots, but you will not probably, if they are oblique, of course, if they are exactly in the same plane, you will see them. If you have lots of students or lots of years in front of you, you could investigate them and segment them manually, all of them. But we don't have that. So we tried to develop another technique with some colleagues from ID15. So the idea was to investigate, to do X-ray diffraction tomography, to have a tomographic image of the bone, so a 3D image of the bone, of the fossil bone, and to have X-rays, so to have the information of the crystals, their orientation. So the idea is that you will get the angle for the apatite crystal, and then you will, on the map, be able to identify it, although it's pretty difficult, but you should be able to identify it. And thanks to the magics of the physicists, we were able to have a mapping of the orientation of this crystal on this 300 million years old salamander here. So this is a cross-section of the tibia, I think, tibia. And you can see that you have a disturbance of the orientation in that direction and in that direction, as well as you can see it with polarized light, because we control that and we check that with polarized light, here with this thin section, here and here. So for the first time with this technique, we were able to image and map the muscle insertions. So now the big challenge will be to do it at high resolution, as we were able to do on a 2D thin section, but in 3D. So if I do my wish list for the SRF, the best would be to be able to conduct precise multi-scale approach during experiments on the new beamline of BM18, and to use high resolution on very, very dense samples. So when you need a lot of energy to go and to go through the samples. And with the improvement of the beamline ID15, it would be fantastic to be able to do a higher resolution of X-ray diffraction tomography, and be able to do it at 20 micron, for example, and with a faster measurement, so that we can do it in 3D, not to be constrained to the 2D orientation. And I want to thank you all for your attention. I thank my dear organizers and those who invited me. I want to thank also my collaborator once again, all the collection managers who were very helpful to provide the material, the people who helped us for the experiment, for the fruitful discussion and the funding. Thank you.